So thank you for coming, everyone. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Paul Skinner, founder of Marketing Kind, and welcome to this Marketing Kind exchange, in which we'll be asking if we're good enough at telling the truth to survive the climate emergency. Now, although we'll be discussing a big global emergency, we don't have any drills planned. So for everybody who's here in the room rather than online, if you hear a fire alarm, please proceed either to the fire exit, which is the entrance that we all use to arrive, or apparently there is another fire exit just behind us here, if that's closer to you. As a small community, we are of course particularly dependent on our members, and so I would also of course like to start by thanking Caroline Bates and Citizen Good for giving us such a warm welcome this evening. Caroline has... Caroline has done so much behind the scenes to make this evening possible, and did all of those exact same things, as well as chairing and hosting our last in-person exchange, which was also here with John Miller, which was already one of our most interesting conversations, and has set the bar very high for this evening as well. If Global PLC could replicate proportionately the level of generosity and genuine commitment to achieving a positive impact of Citizen Good, then it's highly likely that many of the problems we come together to work on at Marketing Kind would either already be solved or maybe wouldn't have arisen in the first place. So at Marketing Kind, we are profoundly interested in the narratives that shape how we live and work, and how we might change those narratives for the better, and therefore change our lives and work for the better. And this evening, we'll be exploring if there is a discrepancy between the realities of the climate emergency and how we talk about the climate emergency in public life and across society, as well as the implications of that and what we might be able to do to put that right. Now, if that sounds like a tall order, fortunately we are in extremely good company to take it on, because we are joined this evening by Professor Mike Berners-Lee and by the Right Honourable John Selwyn Gummer, Lord Deben. Mike is already a veteran performer at Marketing Kind, having participated in our previous exchange on pathways to climate-compatible living, and is a real hero to many of us in the community, myself included. He is a global expert in carbon metrics, a professor at Lancaster University, the founder of Small World Consulting, and the author of numerous highly influential books. Several people in the community were saying just this week that their favourite was How Bad Are Bananas? My personal favourites, I have two. One of them is There Is No Planet B, which you can see by the number of post-it notes, how much influence that's had on me over the past few years. And my other favourite I can't hold up because it isn't out yet, which is A Climate of Truth, which is particularly relevant for this evening's conversation. It will be out in 2025. I have had the good fortune of reading a preliminary draft, and I highly recommend it. Lord Deben is, of course, also one of our greatest leaders on sustainability in the UK and globally. For 11 years, he chaired the Climate Change Committee. Before that, he was the longest-serving Secretary of State for the Environment, and described by Friends of the Earth as our best ever Environment Secretary. And yet, despite those long tenures, the majority of his career has been in business. He's the founder of Sancroft International, which advises businesses on their sustainability and ESG strategies. And I believe he's also currently a trustee of Cool Earth and the Blue Marine Foundation. So welcome both of you to Marketing Kind. I know that you've met previously and even done an event together with John Miller, who was our last guest for an exchange. So do feel free to pick up on each other's observations, as well as responding to my questions. And a little bit later on, of course, we'll get to group discussion. So Mike, if I could turn to you first to get us started. You know, the climate emergency is now really in our faces, in everything from extreme weather events to seasonality. So is it really the case that there is still a discrepancy between the reality of the climate emergency and how we talk about it in public life? And if so, what are the most important dimensions of the climate emergency that are overlooked?
Okay, so where to start with that? So yes, there's a big discrepancy in terms of the sort of truthfulness of how we talk about it. So what do we mean by that? It's not just what gets said and whether that's truthful, but it's also what doesn't get said, and it's also the whole kind of flavour that we pick up. So right down to, if you listen to the BBC and you turn on the Today programme, you will get some talk every now and again. You'll get a mention of climate change, but what you'll pick up from the whole kind of flavour of everything is a general sense that this is not a top priority, and that the most normal thing to do would be to, broadly speaking, ignore it. I mean, there is some very cynical dishonesty around climate. It's been highly effective. There's, bogus think tanks, highly funded, and all the rest of it. They're pushing out, flat out, climate denial to great effect. So there's all kinds of levels of dishonesty around this. In my book, I have a whole section on a taxonomy of deceit, because lies are just the kind of easiest, most obvious bit of truthfulness. But there's lots more to it than that. What are the biggest things that what are the biggest gaps? I think you asked, in terms of what we don't get. Well, we don't get anything like a clear enough sense of the risks and the threats that we're facing, not least around tipping points. And we also don't get a clear enough sense of the opportunity that responding to these things could be for us, in terms of, the better we respond, we can do this in a way that the quality of our lives improves with it as well. So a huge discrepancy between the messages we get and where we need to be.
John, if I think back to the event where I met you, there was also a panel discussion with news editors from ITV, the Financial Times, Bloomberg, the News Movement. And some of the points that Mike was just making were put to them. They were asked, why don't you tell the truth? On the topic of the flavour of what we're given, the question was put, you talk as if we're making good progress and we could well be on track for 2 degrees of limiting global average temperature rise to 2 degrees. Why don't you tell the truth? And the response that came from the news editors was, actually, we can point very clearly to communicating that we are not on track, and that the most likely estimates of global average temperature rise based on current performance might be 3 degrees or more, and that this is likely to have catastrophic consequences. So is it really that we don't have access to the truth, or is it that for some reason we're just not engaging properly with the truth?
Well, I think it's very much a mixed thing. First of all, let's realise that there is a concern among those of us who are totally committed that if you frighten people so much that they don't think there's any solution, they will just say, eat, drink and be merry, because tomorrow we die. And I'm very conscious of the fact that fear is a very, very bad driver, as a matter of fact. You've actually got to give people a hope. So there is a real difficulty there. I've found it all the time that I've been doing it. So you really can turn people off trying to find a solution, because there's no hope, so we may as well do all the things that we shouldn't do, because, frankly, it's not going to make any difference. So there is that bit. The next bit about it is that we do constantly talk about things which appear to be so far outside anything we can control that you also say, well, what's the point of my doing anything? Because in the end, it's either the great powers are going to do it or somebody's going to do it, and what I do really doesn't make a difference. I remember being interviewed by on the Today programme, and the interviewer said, well, what can we do? I said, well, we can all do small things which add up to big things, and we can all take part in the political process to make people who can make big changes make those changes. So he said, what about the small things? Well, I said, if we all boiled just as much water in the kettle as we need for our cup of coffee instead of a whole kettle full, if we all did that, we could close down 2 power stations. They were in the days when we had power stations. Right? So the immediate reaction was, oh, that's just silly. I mean, honestly, that's just not worth it. So if you talk about the small things, people say they don't matter because they're too small. It's quite an interesting thing. It's what the church has always found. Is if you talk about individuals and the way that individuals should try to be good, one of the things individuals say, well, what's the point of me being good if everybody else isn't? So it's a long story. Yeah. And I think the third reason is that we fail to remember what are the backgrounds of the people we talk to. I found the other day that I really got over to an audience with a piece of information which is very small. It is simply this: the bumblebee. Everybody knows the bumblebee is threatened by habitat loss and by the chemicals that we've used. But they don't know what is the latest science, which is that the bumblebee is affected by very small upward changes in temperature. And what it does is to make the bumblebee unable to smell as well. Cuts its smelling ability to a third of what it was. So it can't smell the flowers. And it therefore can't get the nectar it needs, and it can't act as a pollinator. Suddenly, an audience which wasn't going to be affected by the whole of Asia being burnt to death, the bumblebee, which it knew and which was very British, because after all, we've got 250 kinds of bumblebee, of which 150 are in Britain, and you don't have it in hot countries. People actually grasped that this was affecting everything. And because it was affecting everything, then it really was serious. And I just think we so often I took the Climate Change Committee around Britain on a Listen to Britain campaign. And we went round and we saw a particular place where the whole block of flats was being retrofitted so that it was fit for the future. And we talked to the people who were there, and my staff were amazed to discover that none of them knew what the word retrofit meant. And they were being retrofitted, but they didn't know what the word meant. And yet we go around talking about retrofitting. So I think that third one is increasingly important. We have to talk about it in language which people understand and issues which they can grasp. They do get worried about a bumblebee, whereas they do find it difficult to relate to the fact that China has had enormous floods, or that the wildfires have threatened the whole of a state in the United States, or that Canada has never had as many wildfires as it has had last year. These big things, they say that, what the hell can I do about it? Anyway, I've not been to Canada and I'm not there, and the bumblebee becomes a very much more potent mechanism for getting the enormity of this problem in that tiny example.
Yeah, okay. Can I respond to some of that? Because I think these are so interesting. The points you're addressing. I think the question of how to tell the story about what's going on, do we say it like it is, or do we gloss it over it a bit, or do we exaggerate it for more effect, or whatever? I think when people play around with kind of trying to work out how best to say the message, I think there's only one way of playing this, is you have to say it like it is. You have to present the whole reality. You have to present reality exactly as you see it, as best you possibly can. Then there's a question of how to do that in a way that becomes acceptable, because the reason you have to say it like it is because as Stanley Baldwin said, not everything that can be faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And the reality is emissions are going up every year, not down. We're accelerating into the crisis. We have to take that on, because otherwise we can't learn from our failure properly to work out what it might take to get on top of it. The next question is, well, when you've done that, so how do people get a sense of agency? Because John's absolutely right. it does leave a sense of, well, I'm just an individual, and if I just put this much water in the kettle, that's not gonna deal with the 50 billion tons a year. How can an individual have realistic agency? And it's not about glossing it over it, and it's not about trying to tell people that what they're doing has more agency than it really has. And I think that's really important. Actually, I think it's why truthfulness is such an important area to get into, because actually insisting on truthfulness over this is one of the points of highest leverage that we can all have. Maybe it's the most point of highest leverage. And then the question of this business of what can people engage with? It's everybody's scratching their heads over it because it's the big phenomenon. How come we don't all collectively wake up? And we're not very good at engaging with huge global things, most of us, most of the time. But actually, if you look at the kind of, I would say, humans need to make an evolutionary change now, right? We need to learn to live in the Anthropocene. We've never had to do that before. And one of the things that we're going to need to get a lot better at somehow is engaging with these big picture things and engaging with things like the lives of other people on the other side of the world who are never going to meet. And somehow we need to develop that skill. I don't know what the perfect solution is, but we do need it.
And don't you think there are two other things that we haven't really brought into and we ought to at this stage. The first thing is that we do have to recognise that there are a lot of people out there who are determined to tell lies. ExxonMobil is lying all the time. ExxonMobil said last week that it was committed to net zero in 2050, but we would be using as many fossil fuels in 2050 as we are now. Now, you cannot hold those two things. What they meant was nobody who is making money out of ExxonMobil today is going to be alive in 2050, so we can do what we like because nobody's actually going to take us to task. And the second thing they were absolutely saying was that what we mean, therefore, is that we have no intention of doing anything. So they are building a pipeline from Fawley to Heathrow, which will carry 147% of the fossil fuels which they carry on their present pipeline, that they have to use it until 2070 if it is actually going to pay for itself. And they know perfectly well that they are ignoring the fact that the government has made very clear, both governments, not just this government, both governments, that actually aviation is going to have to be by 2050 almost net zero itself. So they don't care about that because they decided that they are going to get it right. So why do you think that the Daily Telegraph regularly has articles about how electric motor cars don't work? The whole idea of range, whatever the word is, that when people have not anger, but of anxiety. The whole idea of this is invented by the oil and gas companies, and there are lots of people out there who are purposely trying to tell lies to the public. And in case anybody does think that electric cars don't work, I've had one for 3 years. It's extremely good. I've had it serviced once. It saved me a huge amount of money, although it was more expensive to buy. And I don't ever want to drive anything but an electric car because it's wonderful to drive. And I can hear my wife now. Now there are some people whom I know that would be a disadvantage to, but this for us is very, very valuable. But so let's not forget. The other thing I'm more and more sure of is we forget how unhistorical most people are. We forget that people think that what is has always been, and that we are asking for change from what is. They don't understand, because that's not how the mind is. They don't understand that what we're doing today is wholly different from anything that we did more than 200 years ago. So what is has always been. And then, of course, you can get away with saying it's going to cost 4p to make the change, without saying that if you don't make the change, it's going to cost 8p. You're comparing what is, which you think will just go on being like that, with the change that these I think I was called eco freak. The eco freaks are looking for, and we're very bad at trying to get people to understand that what we're saying we have to do is cheaper, better, more important, and what's more, is actually more natural than the way that we have managed to make ourselves live. And in that bit is the really hard thing to get the truth over.
Yeah. So picking up on a number of those points together, when you talk, John, about the fact that it is difficult for us to imagine things other than they have been in recent times, there's that line, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Some of the lack of truth that you've talked about, for example, Exxon, it's essentially lack of truthfulness coming from massive inequalities of power. You know, if we think about misinformation today, we might think of two very different characters, Putin and Elon Musk, but each in their very different ways have a huge concentration of wealth and power. And when you have a huge concentration of wealth and power, that doesn't lead to truthfulness that benefits the many. So to what degree is the current economic system that depends on government's ability to raise debt, that depends on financial markets that demand growth on their investments, to what degree are your visions of truthfulness and the climate emergency effectively addressed through the current economic system, or to what degree is that the fundamental bottleneck to truth and to agency?
Well, first of all, we just have to put up with it because it's not going to change quickly enough for us to make the changes. I once had a meeting with a Green Party member of the House of Lords, Lady Bennett of Manor Castle, and she got up and spoke to 300 people in a meeting who'd all come to see what they could do about climate change, who'd all come to join in. So first of all, she said, it doesn't matter what we do individually, we've got to do big things all together. And then she went on to say, there's no point in doing it now until we can get system change. Well, if we wait for system change, we'll all be underwater. Let's say this is just nonsense. What we have to do is to make the system that we've got to work. And I start off by saying capitalism is undermined by climate change. Capitalism depends, I'm a capitalist, I believe in it, it's the only way that creates wealth in a proper way, but capitalism depends upon the limited liability company, in other words, being able to limit the liabilities you have, and on insurance, which limits the outside. Insurance is impossible in the face of rising climate change, because what insurance does is to remove so much of the certainties upon which insurance works. Insurance works on the basis that it is extremely likely that something will happen, and you insure against the unlikely. And then you spread that by reinsurance across the world. Now, nowadays, right across the world, heat burns everything. So you can't do reinsurance. I've got a friend who's actually a director of a major investment company. They've just got rid of an insurance company because he said, I do not want to be in insurance for any longer because I don't think it's going to work. So you've really got to take this. And then the third thing about undermining of capitalism, capitalism depends, like any other system really, on a very advanced degree of stability. Now, if you are worried, I say to right-wing audiences, if you're worried about migration now, you've not seen anything yet. And so the whole business of 200 million Bangladeshis living below sea level, of people in Niger where the temperature is rising to 50 degrees, they're not going to move because they want a better life, they're going to move because they want a life. And there was a wonderful comment in the House of Lords by the Minister about 4 years ago. It seemed to me the moment when I really thought things had changed. So literally, because she was asked by David Alton, the great David Alton, was asked about a Muslim horde which had descended on 2 Christian villages and destroyed them. And she said how appalling it was and what they were hoping to do and all that. And then she said, but just remember, the truth was that the Muslim villages had no water and the Christian villages had water. And if you've got children who are dying of thirst, then you find a reason to invade your neighbours. This wasn't a religious thing at all. Religion was merely the excuse for doing something to save your children. And I think we have to say, we live in a capitalist society, we have to say to capitalism that if you want to save capitalism, you have got to accept that these three things have got to be dealt with, and you can't deal with them unless you deal with climate change.
Yeah. We'll dive a little into dealing with climate change through bottom-up approaches, through top-down approaches. But Mike, I sense that you'd also like to comment on the
I mean, I think
economic system and the degree to which that is compatible with properly addressing the climate emergency.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think on the systemic change thing, I mean, I think Natalie Bennett's right that we do need systemic change, but on the other hand, what does that mean for the individual? So I think the empowering question for the individual is to say, what can I do to help create the conditions under which that systemic change becomes possible? That's actually a much bigger and more powerful question to be asking than how can I cut my carbon footprint, for example. And that takes me to saying, well, let's do a whole load of stuff on truthfulness. In terms of capitalism and the way the economy works, the way we do society at the moment, and so on, we've arrived in the Anthropocene, as we've heard, recently. In the last, we can argue about exactly when, but 100 years ago we couldn't smash the whole place up even if we tried. So it's recent, and it's unsurprising that an economic framework and a way of doing all that stuff that was honed in, broadly speaking, before that time, might not be fit for purpose in the new context that we're in right now. So yes, we have, I still believe in a world with markets and so on, but the idea, which some people think, which is that the free market, a relatively free market can sort this out, absolutely no chance. The questions about growth, I think, are really interesting, and we get sort of locked into. People go, are you pro-growth? Is growth essential, or is growth something that we mustn't have because it's ruining us all? Actually, we need a much more nuanced and intelligent conversation about that. We need to say what kinds of growth are still appropriate and healthy, what kinds of growth are essential, what kinds of growth are bad for us. It doesn't matter. But that whole debate is so kind of charged because nobody dare mention that we might want to reframe that. So I don't care whether we call it capitalism or what we call it, but it needs a rework. There's no room anymore, I don't think, in the Anthropocene for businesses that don't fundamentally exist to be in the best interests of people and or planet in some way. And whether, I don't think regulation alone will do that. There needs to be a whole cultural dimension to that. And so that takes you into a whole kind of shift of the way the society thinks about this. And I think it is deep and multidimensional, which doesn't necessarily mean we have to kind of stop the way we run everything right now, but we need to make some really rapid transition.
I just don't like your word still. Is this still appropriate? It never was appropriate. The point is that
we could get away with it. We used to be able to get away with it.
That's the point. I think that this is why I always encourage people of whatever religion to read Laudato Si, the Pope's encyclical, because what that says is so important. It says that climate change is the symptom of what we have done to the world. Yes. And it brings that whole thing together, that what he is saying is, it's the loss of biodiversity, it's the pollution of the seas, of the air, it's the removal of so much of the fruitfulness of the land, it's the way we've treated other people, it's all those things. And it doesn't matter what system you found. That's why I'm very anti this sort of system coming. If you want to look at systems which have created the very worst conditions in all those things, you just want to go to Poland under the communists or East Germany under the communists. It isn't the system, it is the way that we look at the world. And what we've become is people who thought we were the masters of the world and that everything actually depended on us, and that we could do anything without there being any we cease to have any concept of stewardship. And we have to recover that concept of stewardship, not because I mean, I happen to think there is a moral demand of a created world which we haven't made and has been given to us. I happen to think that. But even if you don't think that, the fact of the matter is, if you're not stewards, you're dead. And that is the reality of it. And that's why I do agree with you that we have to tell the truth. I just think we have to tell the truth about how serious it is in a way which is in the context of people believing that we can do something about it. Because if you don't do that, they will go home and give up.
Yeah, no, I think we're going to come around to violent agreement here. Just to be clear on when I use the phrase systemic change, what I mean by it is that this is a very, very multi-dimensional thing. Yeah. So we talk about climate change, and really we have to see that's a shorthand for all the environmental stuff that's going on. But actually, inescapably linked into all that is all the social stuff, all the stuff about politics and economics and stuff. And I agree with you that right at the core of it all are things about our basic values, our basic respect for the planet we're on, for the people, all 8 billion of us who are on this planet. And actually, if I was going to pick a third thing, it would be for the truth, because the truth, as best we can understand it, these problems are really complex, and they demand the highest quality decision making. They have to have the highest quality decision making that we're capable of, and that isn't possible if there's any playing fast and loose with the truth. So whether or not humankind has got away with this in the past over the millennia that we've had doesn't matter. The point is, here in the Anthropocene, we have to raise the bar on this, because if we don't, we're going to sink.
The World Economic Forum at the start of the year identified as the two biggest global risks in our current environment, equal first, the climate emergency and misinformation. And in a sense here, we're looking at the overlap of those two things. We'll come back to the role of business and the role of individuals, but let's dwell for a moment on the role of government, since none of us believes business will do it on its own. If we look around the world right now, there are not many domestic populations who are overjoyed with the performance of their governments. Have we sort of reached a point, John, you talked about the fact that we used to think we were sort of masters of the universe, and we're realizing that might not be the case. Is there something that's gone fundamentally wrong with processes of government that is revealed by our global problems, such as the climate emergency, that government cannot see an effective pathway to dealing with the solution, and therefore resorts to short-termism and deceitfulness rather than genuinely confronting the truth, because they think that's too dangerous? And migration could easily be a parallel example here. Or is there a way that we can see around that?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be historically accurate. I mean, the truth is that people have always thought their governments are not much good and have always thought they wouldn't deliver. After all, we've had revolutions and attacks and all the rest of it. Look at the 19th century, which is I'm a historian by training, and the 19th century in particular. I mean, if you look at that, the governments were extremely unpopular, and they were very much thought not to be delivering, and very often they didn't deliver. I mean, one or two amazing examples where they did deliver, but it is like buying out of the great lands in Ireland and giving them to the poor was an amazing thing for a Tory government to do, but they did it. But at the same time, refused to give home rule to Ireland on the basis that you could always keep people in a condition of in fact, subservience. So I think we're a bit careful about thinking that it's all much worse now than it was. And certainly even worse when people say, well, democracy has failed, as if somehow or other tyranny hasn't. It seems to me this is manifestly not true. There's always this mystic belief that there is such a thing as a benevolent dictator, but no one, I mean, dictator you do know, but benevolence does not keep with them for very long. So I think we have to be careful about that. The real issue is that there is a loss of leadership. If you look round the rest of Europe as well as in Britain, and I say the rest of Europe because I believe the worst thing that we've done for 100 years is to leave the European Union. I think that's a really fundamentally damaging and dangerous thing. I also think it's immoral, because I think it is quite wrong to remove yourself from a position of influence where you can change things. That's wrong. But there we are, we've done that. And you look around the rest of Europe, and there isn't a leader that you would actually say, my goodness, what that remarkable person. And it's true in Britain too. If you look at the now 4 people who are standing for leadership of the Tory party, none of them are suitable for the job. 2 of them are absolutely unsuitable, and 2 others might just about make it for a bit. And you're not going to get me to say which of those there are, but you can all guess without any difficulty. But the fact of the matter is, it's pretty difficult to see in our political system as a whole. I mean, we have a government which I very much want to succeed. We've got to really need to do so, and we'll support it wherever I possibly can. But frankly, it was elected because people thought other people were worse. It wasn't elected with any enthusiasm. It wasn't like Blair winning, where there was an enthusiasm for Blair. There's no enthusiasm at all anywhere in the country. What it was they were bloody well not having the Tories, and they'd vote for a whole range of other people, and therefore we've got this problem. So it seems to me that what do you have to do? Well, the first thing is exactly what you say. You have to be very, very strongly on the side of truth. Now, many of you will not have liked Mrs. Thatcher, but the one thing I found wonderful working with her was that if she knew the facts, she'd stick by the facts. I mean, she really didn't go around asking people what they thought. That's why she was converted to fight climate change. She didn't want to. It was extremely embarrassing, but the science showed that she had to do that. And it was always true that if you gave her the facts, I had from time to time to tell her some pretty difficult facts. On one occasion, which she'd been making speeches all around the country, saying on the basis of the facts that she'd been given by the vets. And I had the vets in, and I really went on and on at them because I didn't believe what they said. And finally, they admitted that they were only saying that because they had always said it, and that actually there was a difference of truth. And I got the truth out of her and out of them. And then very early in the morning, I had to go to her and sit in her office and say, "Well, Prime Minister, I got 4." storyboards, because I knew she'd interrupt otherwise. So I got my 4 storyboards, and I went through and I said, "There, Prime Minister, I'm afraid when I go to the European Union meeting this afternoon, I'm going to have to change Britain's position." And she looked at me and she said, "On those facts, of course you have to do it, but you better bloody well be right." Which is a mixture. So you had to be right, but my goodness, you could do. Now,
But Boris would have fired you, right?
Sorry?
But Boris would have fired you.
Oh, of course, yes, indeed. Well, I wouldn't have got to his office, leave alone that. I mean, and the same was true of Liz Truss, if you remember her. And what I am hoping that we're going to see in Keir Starmer is nothing very exciting, but an adherence to the truth. And the moment that he moves from that, and there are areas where we can all see the dangers, the moment he moves from that, then I'm in real trouble.
I want to get on to a few questions on what we as a group can do through businesses to address this. But just before we get to that, to take a moment to look at bottom-up change and the role of individuals. One view is that we need to all think of ourselves more as active citizens. A big problem with politics is retail propositions, governments pretending they have the answers rather than citizens taking a share of responsibility. For example, if we think of Finland, which is widely ranked as the world's happiest country for all sorts of reasons, homogeneous population, relative wealth, and so on, but it is not hindered by the fact that 1 in 3 adults in Finland is a reservist in the army, because they have the longest border with Russia. So being happy and actually taking some responsibility yourself for your country's problems is compatible. On the other hand, we have a social media environment already now being amplified by AI, where businesses are making a great deal of money out of polarizing our views, and even antagonistic states are deriving perceived advantage from sowing dissent. So to what degree, in a relatively short time, because we have more questions to get to what degree do we have faith in the future of bottom-up change and truthfulness on the climate emergency?
Okay, I'll go. I think it's an absolute area of. I think bottom-up change. I think there's something that we can absolutely have huge influence over from the bottom up. So if you look at these kind of, we've got politicians and we've got businesses and we've got media and we've got the public, and those kind of four forces need to be helping each other to raise the game, and they haven't. They've been dragging each other down. We've been having politicians encouraging the media downwards. We've had the media encouraging the politicians downwards. We've had the public just kind of allowing a kind of truthfulness, putting up with a truthlessness that's been getting us into all sorts of trouble. The business community's been in there as well, which is with, as John says, some really harmful, deeply cynical stuff at one end, and at the other end, just a ton of greenwashing and so on. But actually, we, the public, are from the bottom up. We are actors in this. So if we, for example, just coming back to what's our approach to politicians, we've gone into, collectively, we've been electing politicians who are charming, even though we know that they've got a track record of sometimes being careless with the truth. Well, what if we absolutely change the dial on that and we say, look, actually, if somebody has clear-cut, deliberately misled the public, that is huge abuse, right? That is an absolute showstopper. So if they've done it once, ever, actually that says they're unelectable unless they've had some, unless they've had some unusual experience that's made them transition from being someone who didn't care about the truth to someone who does care about the truth. And if we then extend that further again and say, you know what, anybody who is in a party and they allow their colleagues to be knowingly untruthful and they stay quiet and don't take issue with it, that means they don't have a high enough standard either, so their credibility has gone down the tubes as well. So we apply a really, really high standard, and now we've got a window of opportunity where we can encourage the current government to raise the bar. They haven't yet got themselves into any really bad trouble over things. Like John said, I hope they won't. But it's now a moment where it's nice to be able to be more encouraging. I've spent the last few years just been despairing screaming about the kind of routine dishonesty coming from everywhere. But maybe now there's a chance. But can we raise the bar by a really, really long way on this, so that if there's dishonesty in politics, it's seen as a career showstopper, and nobody will go near you if you're seen not to be careful with the truth. I mean, it seems to me that, I'm not saying it's easy to get 100% of all the way, but it seems to me that it's an area of really high leverage that that can be from the bottom up. We can do.
Well, from about 6 months' time, you'll be able to see that about every one of your members of Parliament, because we will be completing the programme on the internet, so everything that anybody ever says about climate change will be there for you to see. So you'll be able to see precisely what they've said, and you'll be able to make those decisions, which is a crucially important part. So the first thing is, if you want bottom up, you have to give people the ability to make those decisions. Secondly, we all ought to learn from communities that are able to do it. If you take our small village in which I live just outside it, there are 2,000 people in the village. We have a green team, which means that we recycle everything. The things that are difficult to recycle, once a fortnight they're there to collect them. And they have a group of people who have to pass the recycling facilities for each one of those, so they don't make a special journey for it. They just take it in their cars and stop off and put that there, but then the way to work or whatever it is. Nice. So that we do that. I believe in the community enormously, so recently the families bought our local pub, and we now have a pub which serves local food, and we're very tough about how we do these things, and it's for the community, because my own view is that the point about social media is that people only listen to the people who agree with them, and there's a great deal to go into the pub and have to come to terms with people who don't actually think the same as you do, so you can do a great deal. Yeah. And then we ought to be working through our own organisations. I think the direct point about politics, you're absolutely right. But it's also our organisations. Everybody belongs to an organisation which they can help to be presenting with that. I mean, if you take the two organisations that are doing most around the country as a whole, it's the Catholic Church and the Church of England. Actually, it's the parishes that are really doing more than anybody else. But there are a lot of parishes that aren't doing it, and you have to start with that. And then there's the towns where, I can tell you, the Women's Institute in Essex is absolutely wonderful, really fighting the battle against climate change. And I'm hoping to use them in order to deal with the 2 seats in Essex which are held by Reform. One of the things we ought to say is that you cannot vote Reform in any circumstances, and you have to get rid of them, because that is absolutely unacceptable. But the point is, we ought to be using all our opportunities which we have as gregarious people. And I don't understand how people can take our views and then go to the golf club and not have the golf club doing it as well. You should resign from the golf club. It doesn't.
Speaking of, because we'll come back, but speaking of what we can all do, the only way we can really thank you both for your generosity this evening is by acting on your advice. We've got a room full of people here, we've got people on the internet, so I want to turn to what we can do, because often with truthfulness we're very good at pointing the finger at others. So what do we need to do in our organisations to get on the right side of this? So I'll ask you to both comment, but John, of course, from your perspective at Sancroft, there's been a bit of a backlash against ESG and what it's for. A lot of businesses are also dialing back on their sustainability targets. So how do we correct that? And Mike, to show that there is no censorship here, there's a line from your forthcoming, the draft of your forthcoming book about us. Most of the advertising, when we were marketers and advertisers, but most of the advertising industry makes its living persuading us to want and buy things regardless of whether they will improve our lives or the ecosystem. So how do we change that?
Yeah, okay, so for everybody in the workplace, if we're just dealing with the workplace now, we have to, I've said, all businesses need to exist fundamentally for the health of people and planet. So that question needs asking quite deeply and carefully. And because it's easy to construct a storyline, but we need to ask it deeply and carefully. And if the business you're in isn't doing that, then you either got to ask yourself, can I change it from within? Or you ask yourself, can I get out? And if you can't do either of those things, then you need to accept you're a bonded labourer and see if there is something you can do to change that. But it's uncomfortable. We have to be prepared to not go with the flow on this and to challenge things that are against the culture. And actually, I'm even going to go a bit further on this, because I think it's also outside the workplace. So in the book I talk about the media, for example. So I'm very explicit about these papers. Don't go anywhere near them for these reasons, right? But we have to go further than that. If we want to multiply this out and get a proper cultural change, this is uncomfortable, but we actually have to challenge our friends and our relatives if they are subscribing to media that is contributing to a mass information, because that's the only way we'll stamp it. We'll really raise the bar on it all.
Well, I entirely agree with that. I think also we have to be a bit careful about attacking everybody. I mean, let me give you, I know I'm biased because we've done the work for them, but if you compare this dreadful Chinese company Shine or Shane or Shun or whatever it calls itself, which has no standards of values at all, and Primark, which knows where every single product comes, who's made sure that they've properly paid, has made sure that every fire door is open, who's really gone to, then the fact is you should buy from one, not any more than you need, but buy from one and not buy from the other. We've actually got to be, I once said to the same Lady Bennett, just say thank you occasionally, because then people are more willing to do things. If you never say thank you, they say, well, there's no point doing, because nobody ever says thank you. So saying thank you to the businesses that are doing, and it is true that there are many who have been dialing back, but there are others who are not, and who have been moved, and I sometimes find people who are really doing remarkable things, and we should be supporting them in that sense. But I come back to the thing about everything we belong to. we need two things. One is to get to know what the golf club ought to be doing. We have to be willing to learn ourselves to be able to help people do it, and then use our power and the closest friends that we have to make those changes. And I use a golf because I don't play golf, but I mean it's all those organisations that we have. And I just take this remarkable woman in Essex who's totally changed the Women's Institute. Numbers rise, they haven't been falling, rise, and they now feel they've got something serious to do, as well as all the other things they do. So it's not just baking cakes and being laughed at in singing Jerusalem, it's actually bringing politicians in and telling them what the blazes are you doing. And the last thing is, do use the Friends of the Earth website, which tells you what are the climate change effects in your constituency. There's nothing like going to your member of parliament and saying, I'm not going to talk about climate change in general, but what are you doing about the floods down there? What are you doing about the fact that the old people's homes in this constituency are all endangering their people there because they can't deal with heat? And that's where you begin to, so again, you're touching people where it really matters. And so I think if we all did that, those on the telly and those who are around here, if we all did that, you can make a real difference.
Be a good time to get some questions from the group, since we're all responsible for addressing the climate emergency. Is anyone ready to jump in? We don't, otherwise we can go online. But Simon, you're...
Yeah, thank you. Super provocative, super interesting. I want to dive a little bit deeper into the notion of truth and absolutism and how you challenge truth, because I'm not going to get into Donald Trumpism and sort of relative truths or whatever his language is. There is truth, there is lies.
Yeah.
Good.
But there is also perception. There are also, I don't know the ins and outs of the Exxon view, so I'll have to go up and look at it.
No.
But my guess is that maybe there is an argument that you could create an argument which is that's feasible if you did total carbon capture. Now, you might believe that total carbon capture is never going to happen by 2050, but somebody else might believe that. Is that lying, or is that just fundamental hopium versus, versus misguided reality? And the reason I want to talk about that is because, Mike, I think, if I'm understanding correctly, some of your challenges were quite absolute. We should not buy these things. We should challenge. And I also want to counter that with other things that I've been listening to, reading about how do you help de-radicalise people. And all of the knowledge and expertise on that is you don't directly contrast people. You don't directly confront people. You don't tell people they're wrong. You try and walk in their shoes. You try and understand. You try and approach. And so I'd love a little bit of help as to how do I reconcile those things. It's very easy to talk in absolute terms, but I feel it's probably a little bit nuanced.
Okay. Yeah. So truth, by what we mean by truth is the the best discernible view of your reality that we can get. This question of how to put it to somebody if we think they're completely wrong, I don't think it works. I mean, I do think there's a whole kind of skill and an art form to how do we do this in a way that doesn't make them walk away. How do we do this in a way that's it's implicit. It's it's out of respect that we say this. It's not because we think you're an idiot. Or how do we find a way of making that engagement even when? But I don't think it works to sort of hold back and not say it that it's just, if it's flat out wrong, then that's the reality. And I think we have to get used to, back to what I'm saying, we have to present reality as cleanly as we see it, I think. So, and there is a continuum of, as John's been saying, there's a lot of flat out cynical, very effective dishonesty that's which is the reason why the global carbon curve is still going up, not down, right? It's been right. So there is that end of it, but there's a whole kind of other continuum that has people who are they're in jobs, they're working a career, their life is comfortable, the company gets a narrative, they tell a storyline. Everybody's life is a lot easier if you don't look too hard under the bonnet of that storyline. So it's not flat out dishonesty really, but it's a mixture of not quite brave enough, not quite motivated enough. It's just and not quite taking the responsibility to ask really hard what this is. And I think that we do need also to challenge, but it's not quite the same. We've got a question, at the cynical end, and there are psychopaths out there who we're allowing into very powerful positions where everything they say is not based around is it true or not. They're just asking, will this get me the result that I want? That's all that's in Donald Trump's calculation when he says something, right? And we need to get ourselves out of the grip of charismatic psychopaths. But there is a whole there's a whole continuum, and I sometimes talk in the book. I talk a bit about the Kubler-Ross transition change curve, right? And the humanity is spread out across that curve from haven't even heard, from flat out denial to getting angry about it, to getting depressed about it, and to coming to terms with it. It's only when we've gone right through that and got to the point where we've seen it, we accept it, we've finished being depressed about it, we've been helped through getting depressed about it, that we're actually able to deal with the problem on its terms. And I think we have to take people through that journey, and sometimes that means confronting them with really hard things that they might deny for a while. They might really reject it, but maybe that's what they need on the way to getting to that point of okay, I accept it now, and actually now I can do something about it.
Well, I'm sorry, I have to go in literally 2 minutes, and in that time I'd just say I don't think we ought to confuse the truth, the objective truth, and trying to help people to get to it. So yes, you walk in other people's shoes in order that you can display the truth in a form which they can connect with. And that's what you do, but you don't change the truth. And you don't restrict the truth. You don't say, I'm only going to tell you half the truth. You have to tell them the whole truth. But there are ways of doing it in our normal lives. You just bringing up children. You all know that you explain to them in a way which they can understand, and then they gradually learn more. That's perfectly right. But in their understanding, you don't tell them a lot of fairy stories. You do tell them the truth as far as they can understand it. And that's true about people who haven't had the scientific background or don't know how you make a judgment between proper science and something that's on somebody's internet with no basis on it at all. So I absolutely agree that you have to stick by the truth, and it's more important than ever. When people talk about my truth, it's not possible. There is no my truth. There is the truth, which is the best you possibly can with all the information that you've got to discern what is true. That's what truth is, and it may change with further advice and information. It doesn't mean to say that pushing for the truth when you have this amount of information is wrong. It means that you aren't absolutist. And the difference between what we're asking for and absolutism is that the absolutist is never changed by changing the facts, whereas we are absolute in the sense that we hold to the truth, but we are also open to the fact that some scientific, some religious, some ethical, some other understanding which we haven't had before will come to us, and that will revise what it is that we say. And that's being absolute for the truth. And I want to end by one other single thing. We have become a me society in a way which we have. I mean, me too should have been us too. It's all me. The number of people I've heard recently say, oh, I've got to think about me. Poor girl down the road who's walked out of her marriage because, I've got to think about me. I can't think. If you think about you, that is the worst possible way to approach the rest of the world. We have to think about them, and not only them, but the world in which we live. It's not me, it's us and the planet in which we live. And we have to be really tough. And I leave you with a horrible story. I walked along High Street, the Oxford Street the other day, my way to the dentist, and passed a woman who had, I'm thinking of myself today, I'm thinking of myself every day, I'm thinking of myself always. And I thought, that is the recipe for unhappiness, and it's also the recipe for the end of the world. Just let's realise we have to think about other people as well as the planet. And then I must go, I'm sorry.
Well, thank you very much, John, for thinking of us this evening. And as I say, we will try to repay that by implementing as much of the inspiration as we can from this evening. But we can continue our group discussion with Mike for a little longer. So are there further questions already lined up, or do we have questions online? Claire?
Just got a question about whether you think there's a role for government communication in terms of this nudging and behaviour. Paul often talks about society probably being marketing briefs in disguise, and getting that communication across, like the anti-smoking campaigns, the road safety campaigns. Is there any value, do you think, in actually that harnessing the communication skills that are in this country to try and tell a story in an engaging way that will start to get people to think about us and me, and not just how we're carrying on as we are?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. I mean, at the moment, most of us, most of the time, we're being bombarded by a whole load of advertisements from people trying to persuade us to want and buy things regardless of whether it's in our interests or not. And there's some explicit messages in there, but there's also a whole lot of implicit messages in there about how life works and what kind of things, whether we should be permanently dissatisfied with our material possessions, and whether buying one more thing will sort us out, all that kind of stuff. And that creates a culture that's not the culture we need, and it won't make us happy, and it won't sort the planet out, and it will take us into a very bad place. But actually, we could be supported by a whole load of different messages that create and they don't always need to be explicit. They can be implicit messages about how we are and the fact that we care, and all the rest of it. And some of these things are self-fulfilling. If you tell the narrative hard enough that the only way humans have ever achieved anything is by harnessing our greed, right? And that narrative has really been pushed over the last few decades, and it becomes a bit self-fulfilling. It does become more true the more you tell it. But if you tell the counter story, which is that we're fundamentally a collaborative species, and that life is better when you do that, and the experience of being alive is better when you're more connected with and more helpful to the people around you and all the rest of it. If we tell the story that that's how we are, it becomes more true, actually. And that is, if we want to get through, there are 8 billion people in the world now, and we are on this ship, like it or not, together, and we won't get through with that me thing. And we talked about Brexit a bit, and one of the things that was most depressing for me about the whole Brexit debate, quite aside from all the untruths that were just routinely out there, was that it was a fundamentally selfish debate for the UK to be having. It was like, what's best for the UK? Well, what about what's best for the rest of Europe? What about what's best for the rest of the world? What about the EU was a peace project when it was first envisaged, and all the rest of it. So that whole kind of I think telling the story that we are people who care about other people is so important. And I think often when some narratives are so damaging, and people don't realize how damaging it is. So, for example, America First, right, sends out, implicit in that is such a disrespectful message to everybody else in the world who's not American. But that kind of, that kind of story, that kind of statement is everywhere at the moment, but we could change them around. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about rejecting politicians who lie. How can we convince people not to vote? Because obviously this room is full of like-minded people, so we're probably already on board. How do we convince other people whose belief is that those lies confirm their worldviews, and those lies are actually comforting to them? How do we convince them that not voting for people who lie is a good thing and the right thing to do?
Oh yeah, okay. So if somebody deliberately tells you something that's not true, about a piece of politics, if they had your best interests at heart, why would they ever put you out of the picture, right? So the problem is, it's and people get sucked into their little bubbles, and it's always hard to know whether you're in We always have to, all of us challenge, am I in a bubble at the moment, or not? So it's very easy to say a whole lot of things that aren't true, and it's actually very difficult to flush it out. So Grant Shapps can go on the radio and say, look, our energy prices will all go through the roof if we don't have more oil and gas fields and all the rest of it. He takes him 10 minutes on Radio 4. It takes Climate Brief 3 days worth of somebody's time to put down a whole piece about how that's a load of nonsense, but that doesn't get it out onto Radio 4 and across the airwaves and all the rest of it. So it's very hard it's much harder to uncover this stuff. So when you do, we need to really establish the principle that if somebody deliberately said something to us that isn't true, it means we can't trust a word they say about anything, right? So if you can't trust someone on climate, it tells you can't trust them on anything else that you might care about, whether or not you care about climate. If you find anything, even if it's climate unrelated, that you find someone's been deliberately dishonest about, it tells you can't trust them on climate either. And it tells you that forever, right? So if you have somebody who has been sacked in their previous career for dishonesty, right? It tells you that they can't be anywhere near. They may have some good qualities. They may make a great comedian. They may have all, but it tells you that they don't have the qualities for politics. And it also tells you it's a really worry. Like if a political party were ever to allow somebody like that to become a parliamentary candidate, it tells you straight away you've got that there's something deeply wrong in that party, in the culture of that party. And then it tells you that anybody who stands by somebody who's like that without challenging it, it tells you can't trust them at all either. So, and if you extrapolate that out, it does tell you that one party that has been ruling our country for quite a long time, every single one of those MPs, right, fails that test, right? So I just want to emphasize that this point, the point about honesty has to absolutely transcend party politics, and it really does. It's just that, in that one example of that party, there's not a single one left standing because of the collusion. That's the seventh Nolan principle says, you have to insist on high standards in others, and every single one. So the way to get there is to, it's hard to uncover a single instance, but when you do, it's got a massive multiplier effect. The implications are so big, and we just have to collectively insist on that.
Looks like we have some online questions, and then Teresa.
Yeah, we've got a question online asking, how should governments and individuals curb the power of tech owners who have some of the most powerful machines for shaping people's perceptions?
Yeah, and interestingly, fact checkers have found that Elon Musk, who owns X and has the biggest following of anyone on X, I read an article in the FT that fact checkers had found that 50% of his comments on the US election, of which there are many, have been factually incorrect. So how do we tackle this?
Yeah, okay, so I think the world of IT and AI in particular is not making things any easier for us. I think it's a huge problem. All I've got to say about that is we just need to sharpen our insistence on truth where we can, just even more. I honestly think it's pretty scary. At the moment, you see video footage for something that's gone on in Ukraine or Gaza or something, and it constitutes evidence as to what has or hasn't happened. But in a few years' time, that won't be the case. And that's going to be incredibly confusing. So, I talked about this, it's hard to uncover when when an organization or a person is not trustworthy. And so when that's the case, how can you create a culture in which truthfulness pervades? Well, you have to really have that multiplier effect. So if you find that somebody like Elon Musk has once said something that's not true, that tells you you can't trust anything he ever says again. It also tells you that you can't trust any sources of information over which he has influence and so on. I mean, as far as X goes, I've always been a bit reluctant with social media anyway. I used to drag myself onto Twitter, but I think now, I still think maybe it has some sort of purpose, but I think, there's some really, do not ever only follow the people that know, that you've chosen to follow, that you have verified through information sources that are outside of Twitter. Don't ever go for the For You tab, because that is influenced by Twitter. Don't ever take any notice of the popularity of a tweet, because that is also subject to the X algorithms. So as a whole, do not ever give that platform any form of money. So ignore the adverts as best you can. So all these kind of, if you're going to use it with extreme, just have your filters, have your kind of, have your defense mechanism as sophisticated as you possibly can.
There's so much in that I'd like to pick up on, but I think Teresa had her hand up first, and then we'll go to Elaine.
Make an observation that there's no perfect solution. So I'm thinking about my electric car, but then I'm also aware of hideous things going on in Colorado for rare earths, and it's quite difficult to kind of work out one's path when it's so complex and there's nothing that's perfect and a good answer.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and I think when I stand right back from this, because there's a kind of a day-to-day thing about how can we run our country better and how can we have better politics, how can we make some better climate decisions, but I think there's a really big picture thing on this, which is the complexity of the challenges we face, and the interdependence of all these issues and so on is such that it's really, really confusing. And none of us, we're all lay people on just about everything. We have to, we need secondary sources the whole time. And somehow we've got to work out what to trust. And it's because of that context of it's so difficult that we have to all make shortcuts and say, well, I trust that source, and therefore if they think this is a good, if they say this bank is a good one to go with, okay, I trust them, or or whatever the decision is. So we have to be able, so for that reason, we need to, we have to raise the standards on truthfulness so that we can trust things, so that we can start navigating the complexity, because otherwise we just can't make the high enough quality decisions that are now required in order to get by in the Anthropocene.
Did you look at organisations like Bellingcat in your book, and do you see a role for more organisations like that?
Yeah, I did. Bellingcat specifically got a bit of a sort of short mention, but I did. I looked at sort of fact checker organisations, and I looked at MP Watch, which I've been involved in quite a bit, which is just trying to make sure every voter knew. And I was encouraging MP Watch to widen their focus from climate to just truth more widely, because I think it is a generic thing. Yeah, and some of the problem that I have, and I've talked to people at Fact Check. Fact check if I got the names right. And the issue is it's very dry, right? It's very this kind of truth thing is pretty boring sometimes. Just bottoming out whether something's fact or fictional. It's much more fun just to kind of tell the story and say it with a bit of bluster and it'll all be fine, kind of thing. So the problem they have is kind of communicating it out. But I think if Fact Check does a great service, and so does Peter Oborne on the Boris Johnson Lies website. I think he calls it Political Lies website now. And there are really good sources. And the thing about them is that if you ever go on it to check somebody out and you find they've said something that's clear-cut not true, they've been told it's not true, they've been very explicitly given an opportunity to correct the record and they've not taken it, then it tells you an absolute ton about them.
Yeah. I think Neil was next, and then
Yeah, I've got a question about change and trust. We've got this idea of what we want to change and what we do or don't change from. But we don't really have a clear idea of what we want to change to.
Yeah.
I also work in kind of some change management pieces and creativity, but there are three big things happening at the moment. Sustainability, which happens in conversations like this happen in a silo. We have AI, which in this conversation has got pretty bad rep, but it's probably the most disruptive and amazing piece of technology that could actually save us from sustainability.
We'll talk about that, yeah. Okay.
But also healthcare, we can get healthcare revolutions beyond our imagination. And then we have cybersecurity, which is our trust in data, because there's also that piece where we can't believe what we hear anymore. all of this has been done in silos. How do we join that together, and how do we actually create a vision of the future that we can all work towards, rather than trying to say, actually, I don't want to change from what I have now?
Yeah, okay, so lots of really good points in there. So the first thing is, it's all very joined up. Things get looked at in silos because that's what we're used to. It doesn't work to look at the Anthropocene challenge in silos. So like it or not, we have to try and put it all in our heads in one go. I mean, that's why in the books I write, I attempt that exercise of, can I, into a short book, put absolutely everything from every single perspective, because I think that's what we all need to attempt to do. On the AI thing, I think one of the things that humankind needs to do is change our relationship with technology, right? Because technologies can do wonderful things for us. We need some technologies like crazy to get us through the situation we're in at the moment, but it's also true to say that technology's got us into the mess we're in. So specifically on AI, but other technologies as well, it's not okay to say, it's not enough to say this technology can be used for good applications. You need to also be able to say this technology will not be used for bad applications. And for me that's the really, I don't want to be doom and gloomy, but I think AI is actually quite scary, because when you ask the question, if there was something about the trajectory of AI that we were unhappy about, what agency have we got over that? How would we change that trajectory? Because at the moment you've got a lot of money going in, you've got some very big, powerful individuals and companies. We've seen from the fossil fuel industry and before that the tobacco industry, how when an industry has a lot of financial interest in something and a lot of power, it can really thwart action that will slow it down. So people have been asking me questions like, well, how would we set about regulating the IT industry such that the trajectory of AI we could be more confident would be a healthy one? And I would say to them, well, okay, first of all, learn from the experience of the climate COPs. Learn from the failure of the climate COPs, right? Because AI hasn't got 28 years, 30 years to have huge annual conferences and still find the problems getting worse, still find the problems actually accelerating, right? It's not just still getting worse, it's accelerating. It's getting worse faster than ever. So there's something about, there needs to be some mechanism that's got a lot more agency than that. I think that's incredibly challenging. So sorry to be doom and gloomy. Nothing can be changed until it's faced.
Hi, I'm Hannah, and I was thinking about the complexity that we were talking about and how it can feel so hard for us to do something from washing up anything. And I'm wondering what we can do to affect the decision makers and the big organizations, and what we can do to make it easier for us to do things every day, like in in Lord Deben's community, where it's easy to drop off the recycling and that kind of thing. How can we make it easier?
Okay.
And for them to make it easier for us.
So how to position this, right? So we say it like it is, and we've got this massive global crisis coming our way, right? That's the reality of it, and each one of us is just 1/8 billionth of the problem. And so the kind of an automatic and fairly natural reaction is to go, is to get all depressed about it. Well, there's nothing I can do, right? So what do I think about that? First of all, I think there's a lot more we can do if you ask the right question. You ask, how can I help to create the conditions under which the systemic change can be possible? Then that opens up a lot more leverage, right? So and I know people who've just volunteered on things like MP Watch. They've really changed the dial. Little local groups managed to make sure that some of the worst politicians just didn't get in. Probably. They can probably say, yes, we changed the dial on that particular person not being in politics anymore. So, so that's quite high agency, I think. But there's also, we've all got, we're all in jobs. If we all ask that question, it's different for all of us, but we all can find different routes to agency. I mean, Greta Thunberg's an example. If she can have agency, surely any one of us could have some agency. But I think the other part of the question, I think in this very individualist me society that we have, we tend to think, if I can't solve the problem all myself, then I'm useless and it's not worth the bother. And that is an incredibly individualistic take on it. And actually we need to be able to say, look, if I can be part of the solution, that's enough. Actually, that's good enough. If I can be a bigger part of the solution, that's even better. But we shouldn't feel the sense of it's hopeless unless I can single-handedly spin the whole world on a sixpence.
I think we've got, we can continue the conversation with refreshments until 8, so I think we'll have, because Mike's been in the hot seat for some time, so maybe we have one final question, but just on that, the last comment you made, Mike, there's a beautiful observation in your book that if you vote selfishly, your vote is almost certainly wasted because for all the reasons we know. But if you vote for the government that you think, or the MP who will become part of a government that you think will be in everyone's best interest, then you multiply the benefit of your vote by 68 million. And I thought that was that really stayed with me.
I wish we could get that message out to everybody, because it takes 15 minutes to vote, say, and actually it's never happened. If you trace it right back to the point, I've only traced it back as far as the days when women got the vote. So I don't know how many years, a long time. It has never happened in the UK that even a single constituency has been won by one vote, right? So if all you're thinking is, how can I feather my own nest with my vote, you really are wasting your 15 minutes, right? It's only worth it if you can multiply it up by 68 million, or better still, multiply it up by 8 billion.
It's been added to one of the many Mike-isms that are now salient in my mind. So we have one final question, or have we drawn to a natural close? So I think let's have a round of applause before I go. That sustained line of questioning, as it really was a hot seat. As I said previously, the only way we can thank our speakers is by taking action driven by the inspiration that they've given us. And so I hope we can all promise that we will do our best to make that worthwhile. A couple of quick notices. Our next Coffee with a Cause is, I believe, with the Oasis Trust. The date is still to be confirmed. Our next Your Marketing Kind will be on how we value biodiversity with Shanna Gavran on September 25th. Bring your most difficult questions, because I've tried and she is absolutely brilliant and she will nail them. We've talked a lot about truth and the climate emergency this evening. In our next xChange, we'll be looking at it differently, and we'll be asking how fiction can address the climate emergency with the frontline aid worker turned best-selling novelist Malka Older, so I think it would meet with Mike's approval. And then our subsequent xChange will be looking specifically at going from a me culture to a we culture in terms of how we think about our national renewal, and that will be with Will Hutton, the former editor-in-chief of the Observer. So that's what we've got coming up. But once again, we can continue the conversation for everyone who's here in person with refreshments, thanks to Caroline and Citizen Good. And once again, thank you, Mike, and thank you in absentia to Lord Deben for being so...